How can a man with a violent temper become the saint of kindness? What path must a noble soul walk to renounce all the honors of the world and embrace the poverty of Christ? The life of Saint Francis de Sales, Bishop of Geneva and Doctor of the Church, reveals that holiness isn't the absence of flaws, but a humble cooperation with divine grace that transforms everything it touches. Born in the castle of Sales in Savoy on August 21st, 1567. Francis belonged to one of the noblest families in the region, destined by his father for a brilliant political career and an advantageous marriage. But God had other plans for this young man with a profound gaze and a restless heart. Known as the Doctor of Charity, St. Francis de Sales taught the world that a devout life isn't a privilege of cloistered religious figures, but a universal call for all Christians, regardless of their state in life. His immortal works, Introduction to the Devout Life and Treatise on the Love of God, continue to illuminate the path of holiness for millions of souls. His life, which concluded on December 28, 1622, was a living testament that love conquers all. Chapter 1. The boy from Sales Castle. In the lands of Savoy, where the Alps rise majestically toward the heavens, like stone cathedrals built by the Creator, stood the castle of Sales, ancestral fortress of a noble family that had served the Dukes of Savoy faithfully for generations. On August 21st, 1567, a hot summer day, the ancient stone walls echoed with the cry of a newborn. Francis of Boise, lord of the castle, and his wife, Frances of Sionas, gazed with joy mixed with concern at their firstborn. The child had been born prematurely, and his life hung by a delicate thread. The midwife shook her head with a somber gesture, doubting that this fragile creature could survive the first few weeks. But the mother, a woman of deep faith, entrusted the child to divine protection and the intercession of the Blessed Virgin Mary. The next day, as was customary in Christian families, the boy was taken to the parish church of Thorens to receive holy baptism. He was named Francis Bonaventure, honoring two great saints, Francis of Assisi, the little poor one of Christ, who had renewed the church with his evangelical love, and Bonaventure, the seraphic doctor, whose wisdom illuminated theology. The name would prove prophetic, for this boy would bring the poverty of spirit of Francis and the wisdom of Bonaventure to the souls of his time. The room where he was born was thereafter called St. Francis' Room, because in it there was an image of the little poor one, preaching to the birds and the fish. This image would be a silent companion of little Francis's childhood, who from an early age would show a similar love for all of God's creatures. Against all medical odds, the boy survived, thanks to the devoted care of his mother and a constitution that, although delicate, possessed a mysterious inner strength. Frances of Sionas was a woman of constant prayer and dedicated long hours to teaching her son the truths of the Catholic faith. She narrated the lives of the saints, especially those who had renounced riches and honors for the love of Christ, sowing seeds in his childish heart that would germinate years later. Little Francis listened, engrossed in these stories, and from a very early age showed an inclination towards spiritual things, while other children his age entertained themselves only with games and amusements. He sought moments of solitude to pray before the sacred images of the castle. At the age of 10, Francis made his first communion and received the sacrament of confirmation, events that profoundly marked his sensitive soul. The encounter with Christ in the Eucharist awakened in him a burning love for the Blessed Sacrament that would accompany him throughout his life. From that day on, he sought every opportunity to visit churches and remain in prayer before the tabernacle, feeling an irresistible attraction to the real presence of the Lord. His parents watched with satisfaction the piety of the boy, although his father harbored very different plans for his firstborn. Francis of Boissy, a worldly man accustomed to political intrigues and courtly honors, dreamed of seeing his son occupy the highest positions in the Duchy of Savoy, perhaps as an advisor to the Duke or as a supreme magistrate. However, even in those early years, a flaw manifested itself in young Francis's character, one that would torment him for a long time, a violent and irascible temper that contrasted painfully with his spiritual aspirations. When something thwarted his will, or when he felt offended, he could explode in anger with an intensity that frightened those around him. These outbursts caused him deep remorse afterward, and he wept bitterly for having lost control, even as a child. He began an internal battle that would last for years, the struggle to dominate his fiery temperament through divine grace. This trial, which seemed an insurmountable obstacle to holiness, would become the crucible where God would forge one of the sweetest and kindest characters that the Church has ever known. Little Francis didn't know it yet, but he was learning the fundamental lesson that he would later teach the whole world. Holiness isn't about having no flaws, but about cooperating tirelessly with grace to transform them into virtues. Chapter 2. The Internal Battle. Francis's father, fulfilling the expectations of his social class, decided to provide his firstborn with the best education possible. At the age of 14, the young man was sent to the prestigious Clermont College in Paris, run by the Jesuits, recognized throughout Europe for its academic excellence and its atmosphere of authentic piety. Francis arrived in the French capital with a divided heart. On one hand, he longed to deepen his knowledge of God and the sacred sciences. On the other hand, he carried the weight of his irascible temperament, which made him the object of mockery and humiliation. His companions, perceiving his extreme sensitivity, soon began to provoke him deliberately to see his explosive reactions. Every time Francis lost control, the boys laughed loudly, and he was plunged into shame and despair. The years in Paris were a time of brilliant studies, but also of terrible inner suffering. Francis excelled in all subjects, showing particular talent for rhetoric, philosophy, and theology. His Jesuit professors recognized in him an exceptional intelligence, united with an insatiable thirst for knowledge. But the young man from Savoy wasn't seeking knowledge out of vanity or worldly ambition, but because he sensed that true knowledge leads to the love of God. He spent long hours in the college library, devouring the works of the Church Fathers, especially St. Augustine and St. Thomas Aquinas. However, along with these intellectual advancements, a terrible darkness began to invade his soul, a temptation that almost led him to total desperation. Francis was assaulted by a terrible anguish regarding his eternal salvation. The Calvinist doctrine of predestination, which at that time was being hotly debated in Paris, penetrated his mind like mortal poison. He began to torment himself with the thought that perhaps God had predestined him to eternal damnation, that all his efforts to please the Lord were useless because his destiny was already sealed. This temptation against hope plunged him into such a deep depression that his physical health began to deteriorate. He lost weight alarmingly, lost his appetite, spent entire nights without sleep, tormented by thoughts of despair. His classmates noticed his emaciation and his sadness, but he kept silent about the cause of his suffering. For 6 weeks, Francis lived through a spiritual hell. The temptation was so strong that he even considered that if he was predestined to damnation, nothing mattered anymore. But even in the midst of that darkness, a spark of genuine love for God remained alive deep within his heart. One day, kneeling in his room, he made a heroic act of pure love. "Lord," he prayed with tears, "if I am never to see you in heaven, if I am destined not to love you in eternity, Grant me at least the grace to love you with all my strength in this life. I don't care if you send me all the torments you want, as long as you allow me to continue loving you always." This prayer, sprung from a torn but unconquered heart, was the turning point in his spiritual life. Shortly after this prayer, Francis entered the church of Saint Stephen of the Augustinians in Paris. It was a cold winter day, and the church was almost empty. He knelt before an image of the Blessed Virgin Mary, and remembering the famous prayer of Saint Bernard, began to recite it with all his soul. "Remember, O most gracious Virgin Mary, that never was it known that anyone who fled to your protection, implored your assistance, or sought your intercession was left unaided." As he spoke these words, an inexplicable peace descended upon his tormented spirit. The darkness that had oppressed him for weeks dissipated like fog before the morning sun. For the first time in a long time, Francis experienced joy and solace. The Mother of God had come to the aid of her troubled son, teaching him that confidence in divine mercy is stronger than all temptations. This experience profoundly transformed Francis, curing him of the intellectual pride that unknowingly had tormented him for so long, and opening his eyes to the fundamental truth: God is love, and whoever remains in love remains in God. Chapter 3. Saying yes to God. After completing his studies in Paris, Francis was sent by his father to the University of Padua in Italy to obtain a doctorate in civil and canon law. Mr. of Boise had meticulously planned his son's bright future. With doctorates in both laws, Francis could access the highest positions in the magistracy of the Duchy of Savoy, perhaps becoming a senator or even a minister to the Duke. The Italian university was one of the most prestigious in Europe, and Francis diligently devoted himself to the study of law. However, his heart was increasingly distant from worldly ambitions. During the evenings, when his companions indulged in student amusements, he retired to his room to study not the legal codes, but the texts of the saints and the Holy Scriptures. In Padua, Francis matured a decision that had been germinating in his heart for years. He would consecrate his life entirely to the service of God as a priest. This determination was strengthened during his visits to Italian shrines, especially to Loreto, where he prayed fervently before the Holy House, and to Rome, where he contemplated the tombs of the apostles Peter and Paul. In the Eternal City, Francis experienced a profound spiritual shock upon visiting the catacombs where the first Christians had celebrated the Eucharist hidden from their persecutors. If those martyrs had given their lives for Christ, how could he refuse to consecrate his entire existence to him? But he knew that communicating this decision to his father would be a difficult battle, perhaps the hardest he would have to fight. Francis obtained his doctorate in 1592 with exceptional honors. The diploma was presented to him by the celebrated jurist Guido Panciroli, who predicted a brilliant future in the world of law for the young man from Savoy. Upon returning to Savoy, his father prepared a triumphal reception for him and immediately began to take steps to get him a position in the Senate. In addition, he introduced him to a young woman from a noble and wealthy family, hoping that Francis would enter into an advantageous marriage that would consolidate the family's position. But the young man, with the utmost delicacy and respect, rejected both the position and the marriage, without yet revealing his true intentions. Mr. of Boise, bewildered by his son's attitude, began to suspect that something was up, but he was far from imagining the truth. Divine providence prepared the way for Francis's vocation to manifest itself in a way that his father could not completely oppose. Claude de Granier, the venerable Bishop of Geneva who, due to the Calvinist domination of that city, resided in Annecy, was looking for a dean for his cathedral chapter. Louis de Sales, a canon and cousin of Francis, saw in this circumstance the perfect opportunity. Without consulting the family, he wrote directly to Pope Clement VIII, explaining the exceptional qualities of the young doctor and requesting his appointment. The Holy Father, impressed by the references, signed the appointment and sent it to Savoy. When Francis received the news that he had been appointed provost or dean of the chapter of Geneva, he was astonished at this clear manifestation of the divine will. The dreaded moment arrived to confront his father, Francis of Boise, upon learning that his son had been appointed to an ecclesiastical position by the Pope himself, flew into a rage. For days he refused to speak to Francis, considering that all his plans and hopes were collapsing. There were painful scenes in the Castle of Sales, with the father threatening to disinherit his son if he persisted in his madness. But Francis remained steadfast, though always with filial respect, never raising his voice or responding with anger to his father's recriminations. Finally, on May 13th, 1593, in an act charged with symbolism, Francis publicly renounced all his rights of primogeniture, ceding the title of Lord of Villaroger to his younger brother. He was no longer the heir of the House of Sales, but a poor man of Christ who had left everything to follow the Master, the Father. Seeing his son's unshakable determination and recognizing that he could not fight against the will of God, finally relented, though with a heart torn apart. Francis was ordained a priest on December 18, 1593, thus beginning the ministry that would lead him to heroic holiness. Chapter 4. The Apostle of Chablais. Francis dedicated his first months as a priest to the parish ministry in Annecy, where he proved to be an exceptional pastor of souls. He preached with a simplicity that contrasted with the flowery rhetoric so common at that time, speaking directly to the hearts of his listeners with words that sprang from his own experience of God. His confessional was always surrounded by penitence, for word spread that this young, noble priest treated everyone, especially the poor and humble, with extraordinary charity and patience. He spent hours listening, consoling, guiding, never showing signs of tiredness or impatience. Souls are won on their knees, he used to say, and indeed, he dedicated long hours to prayer before the Blessed Sacrament, interceding for his parishioners. But God had destined him for a much more difficult and dangerous mission. The province of Chablais, located on the southern shore of Lake Geneva, had been one of the most Catholic territories of Savoy until the Protestant troops of Bern conquered it. For 60 years, the inhabitants had been indoctrinated into Calvinism. The Catholic churches had been destroyed or desecrated, and the few Catholics who remained practiced their faith in secret, terrified. When the Duke of Savoy militarily reconquered the region, he begged Bishop Granier to send missionaries to return those souls to the church. A first attempt failed miserably when the priest sent had to withdraw due to the violent hostility of the population. The inhabitants of Chablais, convinced by decades of anti-Catholic propaganda that the papists were idolaters and superstitious, slammed their doors shut at the sight of any priest approaching. Francis volunteered for the mission, knowing perfectly well the dangers he would face. Bishop Granier, although he admired the young priest's zeal, doubted whether he should send him, fearing for his life. Francis was 26 years old at the time, and his delicate constitution did not seem suitable for the harsh conditions he would find in Chablais. But the fire that burned in the priest's heart was stronger than any prudential consideration. If God calls me to this work, he argued, he will give me the necessary strength. Finally, the bishop agreed, and in September 1594, Francis set off for Thonon, the capital of Chablais, accompanied only by his cousin Louis de Sales. The journey on foot, through mountains and valleys, was arduous, but Francis offered it as the first penance for the conversion of the souls he was going to evangelize. The arrival in Thonon was discouraging. The city, which had been a flourishing Catholic center, now showed churches in ruins and a population openly hostile. Francis tried to preach in the squares, but no one stopped to listen to him. Some shouted insults at him, others threw stones. The doors of the houses were slammed shut in his face, and there were nights when he and his cousin had to sleep outdoors, because no innkeeper wanted to shelter Catholic priests. The situation was so difficult that Louis de Sales, discouraged, suggested several times abandoning the mission, but Francis remained serene, responding, "My cousin, souls are not conquered with violence, but with patience and love. If they do not want to listen to our words, we will speak with our works of charity." Francis then changed his strategy. He had studied Calvinist doctrine thoroughly to understand it in depth, and now, instead of public theological confrontations that only generated more hostility, he devised a completely new method. Every night, he wrote loose sheets where he explained with clarity and simplicity the truths of the Catholic faith, refuting the errors of Calvinism, but always with respect, without insults or sarcasm. These sheets, which would later be known as the Controversies, he copied by hand, making numerous copies that he then distributed under the doors, posted in public places, or left in places where he knew people would find them. The content was so well argued and presented with such charity that many began to read them in secret. Little by little, almost imperceptibly, hearts began to soften. Some people began to approach Francis discreetly to ask him questions, and he answered with such gentleness and wisdom that the doubts dissipated. Conversions began to happen, first sporadically, then in increasing numbers. Francis had discovered the truth that he would later express to Saint Jane, Francis de Chantal. The best way to preach against heretics is love, even without saying a single word of refutation against their doctrines. Chapter 5. The Controversies of Charity. The months turned into years, and Francis remained faithfully at his post despite the privations, the dangers, and the apparent slowness of the results. During the harsh Savoyard winter, when the snow covered the mountains and the roads became impassable, Francis continued his pastoral visits on foot, reaching remote villages where no Catholic priest had been in decades. His feet froze on the long walks, and on more than one occasion, he was close to dying of cold. One night, lost in a snowstorm, he had to take refuge in the hollow of a tree, where he spent hours praying the rosary to stay awake, for he knew that falling asleep would mean death. At dawn, when the storm subsided, he was able to continue his way, giving thanks to God for having protected him. The dangers did not only come from the weather. The most fanatical Calvinists saw in Francis a threat to their spiritual dominance over the region and plotted several assassination attempts. On one occasion, while walking along a narrow mountain path, a group of armed men ambushed him. Francis, seeing them approaching with evidently hostile intentions, did not flee nor showed fear. He stopped, looked at them serenely, and said to them, "Brothers, if you want my life, here it is. But before I do anything else, let me tell you that I love you in Christ, and that I have come here only to help you find the road to heaven." The words, spoken with such sincerity and sweetness, disarmed the attackers. The leader of the group, deeply moved, lowered his weapon and said, "We cannot kill such a good man." They let him pass unharmed. And years later, some of those same men would convert to Catholicism. The work of writing and distributing the leaflets with Catholic teachings continued relentlessly. Saint Francis de Sales would spend his nights awake, writing by candlelight, while his cousin Louis slept. Each word was carefully weighed, each argument presented in a way that even the simplest person could understand it. He didn't use the technical language of theologians, but clear and direct expressions that touched the heart. He explained the sacraments, especially the Eucharist, with such beauty that many Calvinists began to doubt their minister's doctrine, which denied the real presence of Christ in the consecrated bread and wine. He defended the veneration of the Blessed Virgin Mary and of the saints, showing that it wasn't idolatry, but filial and fraternal love towards God's friends. He clarified the doctrine of purgatory, of indulgences, of the authority of the Pope, of everything that the reformers had distorted or rejected. Gradually, the atmosphere in Thonon began to change. Conversions were no longer isolated cases, but a constant movement of return to the Catholic Church. St. Francis de Sales had earned the respect of even those who didn't convert by his irreproachable life, his heroic charity with the poor and sick, and his unwavering meekness. He visited the sick without distinction of religion. He helped needy families financially. He consoled the afflicted. One anecdote illustrates his pastoral method perfectly. A prominent man of the city, a staunch Calvinist, publicly mocked the Catholic priest, St. Francis de Sales. Instead of responding with arguments, simply sent him small gifts and kind notes. The man, bewildered by so much undeserved kindness, began to wonder if his religion, which didn't produce such charity, could be the true one. Finally, he asked to speak with St. Francis de Sales, and after several conversations, he converted along with his entire family. When Bishop Granier visited Chablais 3 years after the start of the mission, he was astonished by the transformation. Multitudes of Catholics came out to greet him, something inconceivable a short time before. The prelate was able to celebrate solemn Mass publicly, administer confirmations, preside over the 40 hours adoration. St. Francis de Sales had achieved what seemed impossible, to reconquer an entire province for the Church, not by force or imposition, but solely with the power of love. It is estimated that more than 60,000 Calvinists returned to the Catholic faith thanks to his patient apostolate. Bishop Granier, contemplating the fruits of that heroic work, couldn't hold back the tears. "This young man," he said, "has done more with his pen and his charity than 100 armies could have achieved." St. Francis de Sales, for his part, attributed all merit to God and to the Blessed Virgin Mary, insisting that he had only been an unworthy instrument of divine grace. But everyone recognized that they had witnessed a miracle of conversion, and that the humble priest from Annecy justly deserved the title of Apostle of Chablais. Chapter 6. The Humble Bishop. The extraordinary success of the mission in Chablais and the evident virtues of the young priest reached the ears of the highest ecclesiastical authorities. Bishop Granier, already elderly and in failing health, needed a coadjutor who could help him in the governance of the diocese and eventually succeed him in his heart. He knew that St. Francis de Sales was the providential man for this task, but he hesitated to propose him because of the priest's youth, and because he feared that St. Francis de Sales would reject the honor out of humility. However, after much prayer, Granier decided to send St. Francis de Sales to Rome so that Pope Clement VIII could examine him personally and, if he considered him worthy, appoint him coadjutor bishop. St. Francis de Sales obeyed, although the thought of becoming a bishop terrified him. The trip to Rome gave him the opportunity to practice humility when his traveling companions, upon discovering that he was the famous missionary of Chablais, treated him with excessive reverence that he sought to deflect. In Rome, St. Francis de Sales was received in audience by the Holy Father, Pope Clement VIII. A man of great spiritual discernment wanted to examine the candidate personally before making a decision. He summoned the wisest theologians of the Roman Curia, including the celebrated Cardinal Baronius, an ecclesiastical historian, and Cardinal Federico Borromeo, cousin of the great St. Charles Borromeo, to subject St. Francis de Sales to a rigorous examination. For several hours, these scholars posed 35 difficult questions of theology, dogma, and canon law to the young Savoyard, perhaps hoping to put him in a difficult position. But St. Francis de Sales answered each question with precision, clarity, and depth, showing not only erudition, but genuine understanding of divine truths. What most impressed the examiners was the humility with which he responded, without any hint of pride or presumption, attributing all knowledge to the grace of God. The Pope, convinced that the Holy Spirit had guided the election, confirmed the appointment of St. Francis de Sales as coadjutor Bishop of Geneva and titular Bishop of Nicopolis. On March 15th, 1599, St. Francis de Sales was then 31 years old. The episcopal consecration took place shortly thereafter, and the new bishop received the pastoral staff with tears of emotion, knowing that shepherd's crook represented the tremendous responsibility of guiding souls to heaven. Before returning to Savoy, St. Francis de Sales spent time in prayer before the tombs of the apostles Peter and Paul, asking them for the grace to be a good shepherd as they had been, willing to give his life for the sheep if necessary. Upon returning to Annecy, he was received with great joy by the clergy and the people, who saw in their new bishop a true living saint. But St. Francis de Sales' episcopate wouldn't be easy. His diocese comprised territories in Savoy, France, and Switzerland, with complex political and religious situations. Furthermore, although he was titular Bishop of Geneva, he couldn't reside in that city, which remained firmly Calvinist and where the very name Catholic was anathema. He had to govern his diocese from Annecy, visiting the most remote parishes on foot or on horseback, sparing no sacrifices. When King Henry IV of France, who had heard of the young bishop's virtues and talents, offered him the bishopric of a rich diocese in France, Francis responded with words that would become famous: "I have married a poor woman, and I cannot abandon her for a richer one." This response revealed Francis's pastoral heart. His diocese wasn't a position to become wealthy or gain prestige, but a beloved wife to whom he had promised fidelity. As bishop, Francis dedicated himself totally to the reform and renewal of his diocese. He held synods to improve the formation of the clergy, visited each parish personally to learn the needs of his faithful, established catechesis schools, promoted sacramental life, especially frequent confession and devout communion. He preached constantly, not only in the Cathedral of Annecy, but in the smallest villages, always with that simplicity that made his words accessible to everyone. His personal life was one of extreme austerity. He slept few hours, ate frugally, and dedicated long hours to prayer and study. However, he never imposed on others the mortifications he practiced, but treated each soul according to their capacity, with a gentleness that attracted everyone. The poor loved him because he attended to them with special preference. Sinners came to him because they knew they would find mercy without compromising with error. The nobles respected him for his wisdom and his illustrious origin, which he had not stained with pride. St. Francis de Sales had become a true spiritual father to his people, a living image of the Good Shepherd who knows each sheep by name. Chapter 7. The Teacher of the Devout Life. Among the many souls who sought the spiritual direction of Bishop St. Francis de Sales, there was a young woman named Emily Bennet, cousin of Baron Chandler, who lived in the court of the Duke of Savoy. Emily asked the bishop to write her some guidance for living a fervent Christian life amidst the worldly obligations of the court. Francis agreed, but soon realized that what Emily needed wasn't just a few letters, but a complete and systematic guide to the spiritual life. He then began to write what would become one of the masterpieces of Catholic spirituality, the Introduction to the Devout Life, a book that would revolutionize the way we understand holiness. The work was directed to Philothea, a symbolic name that means soul that loves God, representing every person who sincerely desires to live in grace. The radical novelty of the Introduction to the Devout Life consisted in demonstrating that holiness was not an exclusive privilege of priests and religious, but a universal call for all Christians, whatever their state of life. Francis wrote for the soldier in his camp, for the craftsman in his workshop, for the mother in her home, for the governor in his mansion, showing that each one could and should aspire to Christian perfection in the midst of their ordinary occupations. It is an error, and even a heresy, he proclaimed with courage, to want to banish the devout life from the companies of soldiers, from the workshops of laborers, from the court of governors, and from the homes of married couples. This statement, which seems obvious to us today, was revolutionary in an era where it was thought that only religious people could achieve true holiness. The book was structured in 5 parts that guided the reader step by step on the path of the devout life. The first part dealt with the purification of the soul through general confession and the abandonment of sin and all disordered affection. Francis taught that it is not enough to leave sin, but that it is necessary to uproot all attachment to it. Like someone who not only leaves Egypt with their body, but stops longing for the garlic and onions they ate there. The second part explained how to rise to God through prayer and the sacraments, especially Holy Mass and frequent communion, a practice that Francis promoted fervently in an era where most Catholics only took communion once a year. The third part presented the virtues that the devout Christian should practice: patience, humility, gentleness, obedience, chastity, and poverty of spirit adapted to each state of life. The fourth part warned about the most common temptations and how to combat them, while the fifth taught how to periodically renew good intentions to persevere on the path. What made the work particularly attractive was Francis's style. He wrote with elegance but without affectation, using comparisons taken from nature and everyday life that everyone could understand. He compared the degrees of love of God with the different ways birds fly. Ostriches never fly, chickens fly, but rarely, slowly and very low, but eagles, doves, and swallows fly frequently, quickly and very high. Thus, sinners do not fly towards God. Those who simply fulfill the commandments fly slowly, but the devout fly high and fast towards heaven. The Introduction to the Devout Life was published in 1609 and had an immediate and extraordinary success. In a few years, it was translated into 17 languages, and editions multiplied ceaselessly. The book reached the hands of kings and farmers, of noble ladies and maids, of all those who longed to live their faith with greater depth. Saint Vincent de Paul recommended it to all his missionaries and to the Daughters of Charity. Saint Jane Frances de Chantal meditated on it constantly. Innumerable saints of the following centuries would testify that this book had been instrumental in their conversion or their spiritual progress. Francis had achieved, with his pen guided by the Holy Spirit, what no erudite treatise had achieved, making the life of holiness accessible to ordinary people, showing them that God calls them to the perfection of love, not despite their worldly occupations, but precisely in the midst of them and through them. The Doctor of Charity was thus born from the pen of the humble Bishop of Geneva. Chapter 8. The Visitation of the Blessed Virgin Mary, on June 6, 1610, the Feast of the Holy Trinity. The Congregation of the Visitation of the Blessed Virgin Mary was officially founded in Annecy. Francis had chosen that name, inspired by the mystery of the visitation of the Blessed Virgin Mary to her cousin Saint Elizabeth, wanting his spiritual daughters to imitate the virtues of Mary, her humility and her charity, her readiness to serve. Francis's original idea was revolutionary for his time: to create a congregation of women who were not cloistered, who could go out to visit the sick and poor, bringing material and spiritual comfort to those in need. He wanted the visitation to welcome women of delicate health or advanced age, who couldn't endure the austerities of existing contemplative orders. Because Saint Francis de Sales knew that holiness doesn't depend on bodily mortifications, but on love, Jane of Chantal was the first to pronounce her vows, along with 2 companions. The ceremony was simple, but profoundly emotional. St. Francis de Sales, as founder and superior of the new congregation, received the vows of those first visitandines with tears of joy. He gave them the constitutions that he himself had drafted, inspired by the rule of St. Augustine, but adapting it to the specific needs of his new religious family. He spoke to them of the spirit that should animate them: sweetness, humility, complete abandonment to divine providence. "I don't ask great penances of you," he told them, "but a great love. I prefer that you perfectly maintain fraternal charity over all the vigils and fasts in the world." He taught them that true mortification consists in patiently enduring the defects of others, in renouncing one's own will through obedience, in faithfully fulfilling daily duties for the love of God. The early years of the Visitation were a time of consolidation and growth. The small community attracted young women who sought a religious life less physically austere than the Carmelites or the Poor Clares, but no less holy. St. Francis de Sales frequently visited the monastery, giving spiritual conferences to his daughters, who carefully noted them down. These talks, known as spiritual entertainments, contain profound teachings about the interior life, expressed with the sweetness and simplicity characteristic of the saint. He spoke to them about how to maintain peace of heart amidst their occupations, how to transform the smallest actions into acts of divine love, how to progress in humility without falling into discouragement. Jane of Chantal, as superior, faithfully implemented the founder's teachings, becoming a spiritual mother to the religious. However, St. Francis de Sales' original plan to have a non-cloistered congregation had to be modified. The Archbishop of Lyon, where a second Visitation monastery had been established, insisted that, in order to be officially approved, the congregation had to adopt strict papal enclosure, like all women's orders of the time. St. Francis de Sales, although saddened to have to renounce the original charism of visiting the sick and the poor, humbly accepted, recognizing that the will of God was manifested through ecclesiastical authority. Thus, in 1618, the Visitation formally became a contemplative order, although it maintained the spirit of active charity through prayer for the needs of the Church. Jane also added the apostolate of educating girls, especially from noble families, creating schools attached to the monasteries. The growth of the Visitation was extraordinary. When St. Francis de Sales died in 1622, there were 13 monasteries. When Jane died in 1641, there were 86. The Salesian spirituality, with its emphasis on sweetness, trust in God, and merciful love, spread throughout France and beyond. The Visitandines became centers of prayer and spiritual formation, radiating the influence of the spirit of their holy founder. St. Francis de Sales, although extremely busy with his episcopal duties, never stopped caring for his congregation, writing letters of direction, visiting the monasteries when he could, sustaining his daughters with his prayer and his advice. The Visitation was for him the work of the hearts of Jesus and Mary, and indeed, centuries later, it would be in a Visitation monastery that Saint Margaret Mary Alacoque would receive the revelations of the Sacred Heart. The seed planted by St. Francis de Sales and Jane would continue to bear fruit to this day. Chapter 9. Treatise on the Love of God. Despite the many occupations of his episcopate and the care of the Visitation, St. Francis de Sales felt in his heart the desire to write a deeper work than Introduction to the Devout Life. That first work had been written for beginners in the spiritual life, showing them the first steps on the path. But St. Francis de Sales longed to write for those who had already advanced in holiness, to lead them to the heights of union with God through perfect love. For years he meditated on this project, accumulating notes and reflections, praying that the Holy Spirit would illuminate him. Finally, between 1613 and 1616, he drafted his masterpiece of mystical theology, the Treatise on the Love of God, a book that Pope Pius V would call centuries later a work of extraordinary theological, philosophical, and spiritual transcendence. The Treatise on the Love of God is a systematic, yet profoundly poetic exploration of the loving relationship between God and the human soul. Saint Francis de Sales begins by showing how God has inscribed in the human heart the capacity and the longing to love, how every person, even without knowing it, seeks the true love that is only found in God. He then explains how the love of God is born and grows in the soul, passing through different degrees of intensity. He describes the process of conversion as an awakening of love, where the soul finally recognizes that only God can quench its thirst. Then he leads the reader along the paths of spiritual progress, showing how love is purified, strengthened, becomes increasingly disinterested, until it reaches perfect charity. One of the most beautiful parts of the treatise is where St. Francis de Sales explains the conformity of the human will with the divine will, which is the essence of perfect love. Love, he writes, does not consist in feeling God, but in wanting what God wants. He distinguishes between the will of divine pleasure, which is what God actively wants, and the will of permission, which is what God permits without directly wanting, such as sin and evil. He teaches that the perfect soul must love the will of God in all its manifestations, finding sweetness even in the crosses that providence allows. This doctrine, expounded with theological depth, but also with pastoral tenderness, has consoled countless souls in their sufferings. St. Francis de Sales also dedicates extensive chapters to prayer, especially to the prayer of contemplation and to the ecstasy of divine love. Although he writes about elevated mystical experiences, he always does so with humility, warning that these extraordinary gifts are not necessary for holiness, and that God often grants greater graces to souls who walk in the darkness of pure faith. He explains the prayer of quiet, the transforming union, the spiritual marriage, closely following the doctrine of Saint Teresa of Avila, but with his own style, more gentle and accessible. One of his most comforting teachings revolves around holy indifference, a disposition of the soul that prefers nothing except what God prefers, equally content in health or sickness, in consolation or dryness, as long as it is God's will. The treatise on the love of God was dedicated to Theotimus, a name meaning he who loves God, just as the introduction had been dedicated to Philothea. With this work, St. Francis de Sales completed his spiritual teaching. He had first shown how to begin the devout life, and now he showed where that path led to the summit of perfect love, where the soul lives only for God and in God. The book, although more profound and therefore less popular than the introduction, was immediately recognized by theologians as a masterpiece. Great mystics and doctors of the Church studied it with veneration. St. Vincent de Paul said that he had learned more about the love of God in that book than in all the others he had read, and indeed, St. Francis had managed to present the highest mystical doctrine without ever losing sight of the fact that he was writing to help souls love God more, not to show off erudition. Every page breathed love. Every chapter ignited in the reader the desire to reciprocate God's infinite love. Chapter 10, The Holy Transit. The last years of St. Francis de Sales' life were marked by unceasing apostolic activity. Despite the progressive deterioration of his health, the exhausting work of administering the diocese, the long hours in the confessional, the pastoral visits on foot through mountainous terrain, the voluminous correspondence with souls seeking his direction, all this had undermined a body that was never robust. St. Francis suffered from frequent headaches that left him prostrate, digestive problems that prevented him from eating normally, chronic fatigue that he combated only with willpower. His doctors begged him to moderate his pace of work, to rest, but he replied with gentleness, "There is so much to do for souls, and so little time. I will rest in heaven." He continued to rise before dawn for prayer, attending to all who requested his help, writing letters until the late hours of the night. In the autumn of 1622, St. Francis was invited by the Duke of Savoy to accompany Duchess Christina of France on a trip to Avignon. The bishop accepted out of obedience, although he sensed that this trip would be his last. During the journey, he preached several times despite feeling increasingly weak. In Lyon, where they were to spend the winter, St. Francis continued with his usual pastoral activity, preaching, hearing confessions, visiting the sick, but his body could take no more. On December 27th, after celebrating Holy Mass, he suffered a stroke that left him partially paralyzed. He was taken to a small room in the Visitation Monastery of Lyon, where the nuns cared for him with filial devotion. St. Francis retained full consciousness and mental lucidity despite the paralysis affecting his body. When Joan of Chantal, who was in another monastery, received the news that her spiritual father was dying, she rushed to Lyon, but arrived only a few hours after St. Francis had lost the ability to speak. The holy bishop recognized her with his gaze, and his eyes expressed all the paternal love that words could no longer pronounce. Joan knelt beside the bed, weeping tears of sorrow, but also of gratitude for all that this saint had taught her. The Visitation nuns surrounded the bed of their father and founder, praying the rosary and softly singing hymns to the Blessed Virgin Mary, whom St. Francis had loved with filial tenderness throughout his life. At dusk on December 28th, the feast of the Holy Innocents, St. Francis made a last effort to speak. He could barely whisper, "Jesus, Mary." Then, with an expression of profound peace on his face, he breathed his last. He was 55 years old, the soul of the holy Bishop of Geneva, finally freed from the bonds of his sick body, flew to heaven to receive the reward of the good and faithful servant. The bells of all the churches in Lyon began to toll, announcing that a saint had died. The news spread quickly, and multitudes flocked to the monastery to venerate the remains of one who in life had been a father, teacher, and friend to so many. The poor mourned the loss of their protector, the sinners of the merciful confessor, the devout souls of the wise director. St. Francis's body was solemnly taken to Annecy, where it was buried in the Church of the Visitation. Immediately, graces and miracles obtained through his intercession began to be reported. The process of beatification began a few years after his death. St. Francis was beatified in 1662 by Pope Alexander VII and canonized by the same pontiff in 1665. In 1877, Pope Pius IX declared him a Doctor of the Church, officially recognizing the eminence of his doctrine. The title given to him was Doctor of Charity, for all his teaching revolved around the love of God. In 1923, Pope Pius V named him the patron saint of Catholic journalists and writers, honoring the apostolate of the pen that he had exercised with such effectiveness. His incorrupt heart is preserved as a relic in the Visitation Monastery of Treviso, Italy, a permanent testament to that heart that burned with divine love and taught the whole world the way of love. Chapter 11. Prayer to St. Francis de Sales. Glorious St. Francis de Sales, Doctor of Charity and teacher of the Devout Life, you who transformed a violent temperament into angelic sweetness through divine grace, teach me the path of holiness. Intercede for me before God, that I may learn to love with the meek and humble heart that you cultivated throughout your life. Help me to understand that true devotion does not consist in extraordinary feelings, but in faithfully fulfilling the will of God in my daily duties, whatever my state of life may be. Holy Bishop who reconquered thousands of souls for the Church with the force of love and not of arms, Intercede for the conversion of those who have strayed from the faith. Obtain for the church pastors according to God's own heart, who preach the truth with courage, but also with charity. Make me myself an instrument of evangelization in my environment, not with empty words, but with the testimony of a life consistent with the gospel. Teach me to defend the faith with firmness, but always with the gentleness that was your hallmark. Father of souls, who wrote to show that we are all called to holiness, free me from thinking that Christian perfection is the privilege only of religious. Help me to embrace my own calling and to become the best version of myself through faith and love. Help me to sanctify my everyday tasks, offering them to God with love and transforming daily obligations into opportunities for spiritual growth. Teach me that true devotion consists of doing God's will promptly, frequently, and with joy, faithfully fulfilling the duties of my state in life. Doctor of divine love, ignite in my heart the fire of holy affection. Grant me the grace to conform my will to God's in all circumstances, finding peace both in trials and in moments of consolation. Free me from disordered attachment to earthly things and from the desire to control my life according to my own plans. Help me understand that to live is to love, and that true love is demonstrated through total surrender to the divine will. Beloved Saint Francis de Sales, intercede for all those who minister in spiritual guidance, that they may imitate your wisdom and patience. Present all my needs to the Lord, especially the intention I hold in my heart. But above all, ask him to grant me the grace to love him with all my strength, and to love my neighbor as myself, so that when my final hour arrives, I too may entrust my spirit to God, uttering the sweet names of Jesus and Mary, and that I may deserve to join you in heaven to praise the God of love eternally. Amen.